All right, let's start talking about chapter 3, biomes. We talked about climate and how the climate varies around the planet, and so that's going to have a big impact on the communities of living things that we see both on land and into the sea to a certain extent, but we'll focus on land first in this section. And so we get some typical kinds of um, communities of plants and animals in areas that have a particular climate. We know these as biomes that have a characteristic physical environment, a combination of temperature and precipitation. And this tends to lead to particular kinds of plant communities. And we tend to characterize biomes by their plant communities because plants tend to be the dominant, most abundant biomass in the system. But of course, biomes also have some characteristic types of animals as well. But we'll focus on plants here. And so here's just a few examples. For example, where you have temperate climates, cool and warm seasons with moderate rainfall throughout the year. You tend to get temperate climates again with these deciduous trees that lose them in the wintertime. Um, Dry climates are going to be characterized by lots of cacti and other plants that are adapted to those dry conditions. In areas that are warm and wet year-round, in the tropical rainforest, you have these trees that are evergreens year-round, broadleaf trees, whereas in climates that tend to be rather cold, you tend to find evergreens that have needles, basically the conifers. Um, so just a few examples. Um, and again, it's the moisture levels, temperature, light levels, and also the impact of animals that shape the kinds of plants that you find in a given area. Now, here's an interesting phenomenon that you see in living things of all kinds, but we'll focus on these plants here, is what's called convergent evolution. So, if you look around the globe, for example, you'll find on different continents similar kinds of habitats because they have the similar combination of physical characteristics, moisture, light, etc., temperature. Um, and so it would make sense that where on distant locations on the globe you have a similar kind of climate, you'll have the same kinds of plants in particular living there. And so when you look here at these two plants, of course they look very similar because they grow in very similar habitats. But one is a cactus and one is what's called a euphorbs. And cactuses are found in the New World, that is the Americas, and euphorbs are found in the Old World, primarily Africa. So they're different plants, different plant families. They're not really related to each other at all, but yet you can see because of the environments they're growing in, their evolution has caused their phenotype, the way they look, to converge onto a particular growth form, which is quite adaptive for dry climates. All right, so biomes again influenced by precipitation and temperature, and of course precipitation and temperature fall on a continuum, and so at very low precipitation levels, we of course tend to have deserts, or if it's really cold, what we would call a tundra. And you can see deserts span quite a range of temperatures, but they're always going to be dry. Um, Tundra is pretty much always going to be cold, um, and it tends to be relatively dry, although sometimes it is a little warmer and wetter than otherwise. Um, Tropical areas are always going to be warm. You have some that get rainfall throughout the year, tropical rainforests, some that tend to have a dry and a wet season, these tropical seasonal forests. Temperate areas where you have cool seasons and warm seasons, or cold and hot seasons, some with deciduous forests like we have around here, some with evergreen forests. Grasslands, these are areas that get less precipitation, as you can see, than forested areas. And then temperate shrublands, we'll see examples of those. Those are areas that tend to be quite dry and often are also prone to seasonality in precipitation. Boreal forests, these are forests found way up north, a range of precipitation, but tend to be relatively cold climates. Here's a map of where you find these. So those temperate forests here in North America, Asia, and Europe, tropical forests along the equator in South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, grasslands where it tends to be drier, or often in the rain shadow, for example, um, South Africa as well. The light green, which tends to be adjacent to tropical areas, these are tropical areas, but they tend to have seasonality of rain surrounding the Congo and Amazon, for example, and a good chunk of India and parts of southern China. Um, the boreal forest up north, um, almost exclusively in the northern hemisphere, good chunks of Canada and Asia, Russia, out in Siberia, and then way up north, the tundra. All right, so let's start talking about some of these. Of course, you can characterize these biomes and their climates through climate graphs, which show the temperature change throughout the year, the precipitation change. Sometimes they also have humidity on them. This is the one for Svalbard, which is this island way up north inside the Arctic Circle. It's the most northern inhabited area on the planet. It belongs to Norway, and there are some people, I guess they're kind of crazy, I think, but they live up there. And so you can see the temperature varies throughout the year. Precipitation varies a little bit. But notice it only really on average gets above freezing in early June and around mid-September. So it has a very short season when it's warm and it's cold for much of the year. Um, so there you go. Now, the human footprint, the degree to which people have an impact, that is where they live, their population sizes, and how they use the landscape and what kind of resources they use, vary. You can see, of course, the eastern United States, heavily impacted by human activities. India, good chunks of China, coasts of South America, um, Central Africa in certain parts, of course, Europe, are heavily impacted. Um, when you get to areas that tend to be drier, like Central Australia, the Tibetan Plateau, the Sahara Desert, they tend to have less of an impact, fewer people living there. And also when you get into very northern climates where it's quite cold, you tend to have an impact, a less of an impact. The Amazon, much of it is not very large, significantly impacted just because it's so remote and no one lives, not many people live there. Same with some portions of the Congo, although this is changing as people move into these areas as those populations grow. All right, tropical rainforest. Well, tropical, so it's warm year round, lots of rain. And in these areas, you really don't have seasonality. It's warm and wet year round. Um, because of that, they have lots of plant matter, lots of biomass. They tend to have really high diversity, both in plants and animals and other organisms. Because of the biomass and the extensive forest that they tend to have a significant what you call canopy structure or layering of the forest. And you'll find different types of animals living in the forest. They tend to have a lot of what you call arboreal species of animals that just pretty much spend all their time, or the vast majority of their time, up in the trees. Again, these are areas where there's been lately a significant population growth, and so there's a lot of deforestation of these areas in the Amazon and Congo and Southeast Asia. Characteristic climate graph, again, warm year round and lots of precipitation throughout the year. They have lots of epiphytes. Epiphytes are plants that live on other plants. The air is so humid throughout the year that these plants don't have to be rooted in the ground. They just get the moisture out of the forest air. Now, tropical areas that have seasonality, wet and dry seasons. You can see a good chunk of Africa, the parts surrounding the Congo, are these forests and savannas. And savanna is sort of a tropical grassland that has a sparse tree population. scattered trees. And again, seasonality, they'll have some species of trees that lose their leaves during the dry season, but also a much greater proportion of grasses and shrubs than you would see in a tropical rainforest. There are areas that occasionally have fire, obviously during the dry season. And again, a tropical savanna is essentially a tropical grassland that also has scattered trees. So you see here, tropical is warm year round, but this place in Brazil has this time of the year where it's relatively dry. And so, again, during that dry season in the forested areas, the trees will lose their leaves. Or here you can see a good picture of a savanna where you have a sparse tree cover and lots of grasses. These are going to be the kind of areas where you find a lot of grazing animals, the gazelles and zebras and wildebeest and other African grazing animals. All right, so now we go to areas that are um, dry throughout the year. And as we mentioned when we were talking about climate, they tend to be about 30 degrees north and south latitude. Um, Again, dry, relatively little biomass because there's just not as much production by the plants. A lot of succulent plants, ones that have thick stems or very thick leaves to help store water. Um, Drought resistance, or plants that again will tend to lose their leaves when it's quite dry. Now this label says hot deserts, which indeed you generally see here and here. Now this area not so much, it's a drier region, but it tends to be a little further north and not quite as hot as some of these others. Um, so here we see a climate graph for this place in Algeria. You can see there's a bit of seasonality with temperature, although it is warm, but as you see, it's quite dry throughout the year. Desertification is a process that when areas that at one point in time tended to get a decent amount of rainfall, or at least had one part of the year when it rained, the climate can shift for various reasons and it becomes more desert-like or dry throughout the year. And so this is a process that can occur naturally with climate change, but there are also things that people do that can promote this process, in particular the conversion of forested areas into deforested areas can um, sort of promote or speed up this process in certain places. And of course, deserts come in a variety of types. They can be extremely dry and have sand dunes and all that kind of stuff. Others, they're not quite so dry, but again, you can see cactuses and these plants that are adapted for dry climates. This picture was probably taken during a time of the year in the Sonoran Desert in Arizona where they got some rains, and the herbaceous non-woody plants will tend to grow quite rapidly and flower during those time periods. All right, temperate grasslands around 30 to 50 degrees of latitude, um, primarily in the north, but a little bit in the south. So temperate, they have warm and cold seasons, but they're dominated by grasses because they get less rain than temperate forests. They don't typically get enough rain to support a forested habitat. So they have lots of herbivores like savannas, and so think buffalo and deer and antelope and things like the pronghorn antelope you see out west. The plants, because it's drier, they tend to put down deep roots to try to tap into the groundwater. They tend to have really rich soils, um, so thus grasslands have become areas that are extensively farmed, both in sort of Central and Eastern Europe and the Great Plains of the United States and portions of China and South Africa in particular. Their fire tends to be quite common. And here's an example where, in particular, human activity, where if we overgraze these areas with livestock, it can lead to the removal of too much of the vegetation and lead to desertification. So here we see temperate, again, warm and dry, or warm and cold part of the times of the year, and some fluctuation in the precipitation. So again, you see really no trees in these examples here of grasslands.